Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Patterson, and I am absolutely delighted to be with you here today. I am going to be sharing a few musings with you that I have entitled "The Climate Crisis Calls for a New Story." And I'm just going to share a few slides and share my screen. So just bear with me while I pull that up and we can get started. So, here we go. All right. So I am the president of an organization called Common Earth. It is an organization whose mission is to help usher in a post-carbon carrying society through educational programs that help people understand the various inputs contributing to the climate crisis and to help them identify useful ways of responding to that. And we're organized around a central question, this question of how can we move to a post-carbon carrying society? And have decided to organize ourselves around a question because we don't necessarily think that we have everything all figured out and have a bunch of answers. We just have some inkling that we have a much better chance of figuring this out collectively than we do individually. So we're also really all about community. But I am not here today to talk about Common Earth or even about the climate crisis. I am here today to tell you a story. This story begins during the scientific revolution, which led directly to the Enlightenment, or what's also called the Great Age of Reason, which is defined as the period of rigorous scientific, political, and philosophical discourse that characterized European society from the late 17th century to the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. And this intellectual movement synthesized ideas concerning God, nature, and humanity into a worldview that celebrated human exceptionalism above all else. This intellectual movement emphasized reason, individualism, and skepticism, and also introduced us to modern capitalism. Capitalism is an economic and political system where trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. Its core economic principles are growth, ownership, and profit, and has been the defining story of the Western world sort of since that period when it was introduced. And it was amplified during the Industrial Revolution and gaining strength ever since. But it wasn't sufficient to introduce this new system. We needed a new paradigm in order to make this work. Many economists insist that who we are is selfish and self-maximizing. They even use a term to describe this perception of humanity that sounds serious and scientific, which is homo economicus. And we have heard this story of our competitive self-maximizing nature so often that we've accepted it as an account of who we really are. It's changed our perception of ourselves, and our perceptions in turn have changed our behavior and led to our current predicament. A central tenet of this story is the concept of mind-body dualism, which denotes either the view that mental phenomena are non-physical or that the mind and body are distinct and separable. This view allowed for us to begin to see ourselves as special from the rest of nature, as we are the only ones that have a mind like ours. And for the first time, we started to understand ourselves not as part of nature, but as above it. And this led to sort of a bastardized understanding of Darwin's survival of the fittest that has us, the protagonists of this story, cast as individuals, separate from nature, and at the top of the food chain or hierarchy of all other living beings, motivated only by our own rational self-interest. Exactly the paradigm of who we are that is required to pursue profit, even at the expense of our planet, and therefore ultimately ourselves. This story has a lot of implications, and I think it's run its course. I call this story the story of more. And full disclosure, I stole this title from a book by the same name by a woman named Hope DeHaran. So I recently turned 51. And even though this story's beginning goes back much farther, I want to talk about how it has played out in my lifetime. So since 1970, the human population has doubled, and the amount of human waste produced daily has more than doubled. That's because we're eating more than we each did 50 years ago. Our global economy has quadrupled through the use of GMOs, monocrops, large-scale industrial farming, increased pesticides, and increased fertilizers, all of which are terrible for the environment and soil health. The crop yield per farmed acre has more than doubled. Production of meat has tripled. Consumption of seafood has tripled, and the amount of fish taken from the ocean has doubled. And if you're wondering about the logic of my math, that's made possible by farmed fishing. Our consumption of sugar has tripled, mostly due to the ubiquity of it in the processed foods that we eat. The total amount of energy that people use each day has tripled. The total amount of electricity used has quadrupled. The number of airline passengers has increased by a factor of 10. The distance traveled by car has more than doubled. Global fossil fuel use has tripled. The burning of coal and oil has doubled, and natural gas use has tripled, and the production of plastic has increased tenfold. 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide have been released into our atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels. The average global temperature has increased by more than 1 degree Celsius from pre-industrial levels, and some say we have maybe even breached our 1.5 threshold set at the Paris Accord already. The average global sea level has increased by 4 inches, or about 10 centimeters, much of which comes from melting mountain glaciers and polar ice. Severe weather events, including droughts, floods, hurricanes, and wildfires, have increased by a factor of 6. In fact, a person born when I was could expect to have 4 major heat waves in their lifetime, whereas a child born in 2020, even if we meet the Paris target of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, will experience 18 such events. And for each additional half degree of global warming, this number doubles. So what's going on here? To explain all of this rapid growth, I'm going to introduce some basics from a discipline called systems thinking. On the left, what you see is a basic reinforcing feedback loop. And this structure will invariably give rise to the behavior that you see on the right, which is to say you will always be in a loop of either creating either exponential growth or exponential decline. So the state of the system is whatever amount you have of something. It could be the amount of money in your bank account, or a population in a group of rabbits or a group of people, anything. And then that increase rate at which this state changes is either by getting bigger or smaller. So this could be the interest rate or rate at which the population grows or declines, thus changing the state of the system. So when this repeats and goes around the loop again and again, it's creating a reinforcing feedback loop that leads to this exponential change. So the behavior that it gives us is always going to be one of exponential growth or decline. If a balancing loop doesn't intervene to interrupt this unmitigated growth or decline, then the system will invariably collapse, because it is physically impossible for anything to grow or diminish forever. Part of why this story of more is so critical is that we aren't just growing in a linear way. We're growing exponentially. And despite the fact that we're surrounded by examples of exponential growth, we intuitively tend not to really get how it works. So when I said that our economies have quadrupled since 1970, this happens with what is considered just a modest annual growth rate. For example, if an economy grows at a 3% annual growth rate, it will double every 24 years. So I want to do a little thought experiment with everyone today, just to illustrate how poorly we actually understand exponential growth. So I'd like you to just imagine that you have a piece of paper that you fold in half. And then imagine that you fold it once again. Okay, so now I've folded it in half twice. And let's say that the thickness of the 4 sheets of paper in the folded stack is 0.5 millimeter. How thick do you think this piece of paper would be after 40 folds and after 100 folds? So I want you to just think about that. How big do you think it would be? It could be anything from less than a meter to 10 kilometers, 100 kilometers, larger. What do you think this piece of paper would be folded twice? You just saw me do, folded 40 times. So hopefully everybody's got that answer in their head now. The answer actually is that 40 folds is 274,878 kilometers, or almost 7 times around the Earth. This little piece of paper. Obviously, thought experiment, it would be impossible to fold it 40 times, but if you were able to, that's what you would have. And what I really want everybody to take notice of is the shape of the graph on the curve here. This is a really common shape, and it's frequently referred to as a hockey stick for obvious reasons. Even though it's the doubling every time we fold the paper, it isn't until we get close to the end here that those doublings get so large that by comparison to the rest of the folds, it creates this shape where it really takes off at the tail end. So again, important here that everybody's taking note of this shape. And one of the things that I want to just point out is that I think that most of us intuitively understand growth when we're talking about adding to something. So growing in a linear way. It's much harder for us to wrap our heads around how quickly things can get out of hand when we're multiplying as opposed to adding. So before I show you the graph with our piece of paper folded 100 times, I'm going to give everyone a moment to change your answer to how big you think it would be. So everybody ready? Here it comes. All right. Over 1,000 trillion kilometers, or 1,000 trillion trips to the sun and back. Now, I want you to remember that it was at around 35 folds where we saw the shape of this hockey stick end kind of really shoot up in the same way that we're seeing it shoot up here around 94 folds. So what happened to that great big huge curve upwards where it was doubling and doubling again at the end that we saw at 40 times? Well, it didn't disappear. It's just that in order to be able to accommodate the numbers that are required to scale this to get to the numbers that we're seeing when you fold it 100 times, those huge shoot ups that we had around 40 folds and just before 40 folds have kind of just disappeared and into the scale of in order to accommodate 100 folds. But it's the exact same shape we're seeing here again. So things are trucking along and then they really have a huge uptick at the end, creating what should hopefully by now be this familiar hockey stick shape. So what are some of the implications of this? One of the things that is true of our economy is that we are wedded to the pursuit of economic growth. Shown here is our world GDP over the last 200 years or so. And I would say that it's in 1970, it was somewhere around 25 trillion. And by 2015, it was well over 100 trillion. And apart from some small dips due to the recession or during COVID, it's just been increasing ever since. And again, take note of this shape that you're going to see on this graph and on subsequent graphs, because we're going to see it repeating itself time and time again. So here it is again on a graph when we look at our energy consumption. And this is absolutely not a coincidence. The increase in global GDP will always have a commensurate increase in energy consumption. Again, it's right around the 1970s that things start to shoot up dramatically. And it follows that increases in burning of fossil fuel would have corresponding increases in CO2 emissions, which is exactly what we're seeing here. And notice when the shape of the hockey stick kind of really starts to take off. And more emissions necessarily mean more carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere. And because those gases trap heat, it follows that our planet is warming. So we see here the global temperature since 1850, and here is that now famous hockey stick shape yet again. The Earth is a miraculous and incredibly complex system. In fact, the Gaia model asserts that all living organisms and their surroundings have evolved together as a single living system that affects the condition of the Earth's system. And like any complex system, the planet is a self-regulating and goal-seeking system, and balance is its default state. One of the ways that the planet does this is by removing carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and much of this carbon dioxide is then stored in roots, permafrost, grasslands, and forests. In various other ways, the planet traps carbon in our earth and oceans. And when we dig it up and burn it, we are putting all of that carbon dioxide that was removed over millions of years right back into the atmosphere. So of course the planet will heat up and become out of balance as a result, which is exactly what we're seeing. With the increase in temperatures, we get imbalances in our climate that in turn give us more weather-related disasters in the form of floods, droughts, heat waves, forest fires, hurricanes, tsunamis, and so on. So really, our quest for ever more economic growth and the use of cheap oil, gas, and coal to fuel that growth has set this reinforcing feedback loop into motion. So you can see how this plays out here on this graph, where you've got increased growth leading to fossil fuel consumption, leading to greenhouse gas emissions, leading to carbon dioxide concentrations, which of course warms the planet, which leads to extreme weather events, which leads to the destruction of human and physical resources, which creates debt, which leads back to growth. And the relationship between debt and growth is something that I'm not going to delve into in detail here, but is definitely a correlation strongly. So what this is telling us is that we are consuming resources beyond the carrying capacity of the planet as we continue to grow our demand for resources to fuel this growth. So this graph shows the number of days we consume beyond the biocapacity of the Earth. It clearly demonstrates that we're consuming beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. Last year, Earth Overshoot Day was on August the 2nd. And what that means is that every day after that, almost half the year, our resource use was exceeding what the planet could sustain. You'll notice that on this graph, it was in 1970 that we made it into December before we were in this overdraft, so to speak. And another important thing that I want to just make really clear is that we aren't all participating equally in this story of more. A country overshoot day is the day on which the Earth overshoot day would fall if all of humanity were to be consuming like the people in that country. So you'll note that there's no country here that's not in overshoot, but you'll also note that it's a wide disparity in terms of where the Earth overshoot day would fall. So for example, in Canada, where I am and many of you are right now, if we all consumed the way most Canadians did, Earth overshoot day would fall on March the 13th. And if we all consumed the way those in Jamaica do, we would make it all the way to December the 20th before we hit that critical day. And you can see there were a lot of other countries and where we would fall if we all consumed according to the people that live in that country do. And I was pointing at the connection between debt and growth, and this graph shows the unsustainable growth in debt that also takes off at the same time as the growth in our GDP around the 1970s. You can see here that our debt acquisition has followed this exact same curve. Interestingly, in the US, happiness rates, and globally often, in the US though, happiness rates peaked in the 1970s. And since then, the average income has quadrupled, and yet happiness has declined. Similar trends are playing out in country after country. What explains this paradox? Well, researchers have found that it's not income itself that matters, but how it's distributed. Societies with unequal income distribution tend to be less happy. And this is because inequality creates a sense of unfairness. It erodes social trust and cohesion and solidarity. It's also linked to poorer health, higher levels of crime, and less social mobility. People who live in unequal societies tend to be more frustrated, anxious, insecure, and discontent with their lives. They have higher rates of depression and addiction, which is just one more reason, in addition to the resource depletion and carbon concentration, why we should be agnostic about growth. And that this graph here is showing us the unsustainable growth and economic inequality. So the ways in which all of this growth or wealth is ending up in the hands, or being really concentrated in the hands of the few. So as you can see in the graph on the left, in the US, the incomes of the bottom 50% have stayed more or less stagnant, while the income of the top 10% grows exponentially, which leads to the diverging fortunes that you see on the right. Something similar happens when it comes to consumption. So inequality makes people feel that the material goods they have are inadequate. We constantly want more, not because we need it, but because we want to keep up with the Joneses. The more our friends and neighbors have, the more we feel that we need to match them just to feel like we're doing okay. The data on this is clear. People who live in highly unequal societies are more likely to shop for luxury brands than people who live in more equal societies. We keep buying more stuff in order to feel better about ourselves, but it never works because the benchmark against which we measure the good life is pushed perpetually out of reach by the rich, and more commonly by social media influencers. So we find ourselves spinning in a place of on an exhausting treadmill of needless overconsumption. Which brings us to another interesting paradox. While we're more connected than ever on social media, our levels of loneliness have followed the now familiar curve of this hockey stick. So we're currently living inside the story of more, the story of separateness and self-interest, where disparity, injustice, and environmental destruction are acceptable costs in its pursuit. One result of this mistaken identity is the loss of common purpose. Our tendency is to stop seeing ourselves as people striving together to overcome our common problems, and to view ourselves instead as people striving against each other to overcome our individual problems. Never mind that these problems are often much bigger than we are and arise from structural forces that none of us can tackle alone. As individualism, the idea that we can each of us pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and have it all, has become the central tenet of this story, and is therefore the solution to whatever crisis we face. Aidan Ricketts says that our social world has disconnected us from our own ecological selves and from each other through a culture of human-centered individualism. Our society and economy is beset by a toxic collective psychosis based on disconnection. Individualism, anthropocentrism, and perpetual growth are driving both our internal and our external misery. Coming to terms with this personally and spiritually is an essential first step. So, is really another way of saying that this story has run its course. But I believe we're birthing a new story, or maybe better put, we're remembering an ancient one. A story that dispels this myth of separation and reminds us that everything is connected. Modern science is just beginning to catch up with this understanding. Thich Nhat Hanh tells us that to be is always to interbe. Our body is a community, and the trillions of non-human cells in our body are even more numerous than the human ones. There are no solitary beings. The whole planet is one giant living, breathing cell with all its working parts linked in symbiosis. We do not exist independently. We inter-are. Everything relies on everything else in the cosmos in order to manifest. Let me give you an example of what he means. Bees can't exist without flowers, and flowers cease to exist without bees. So even though we don't often think about bees and flowers as being a single entity, when you understand it from that perspective, it's hard to understand or know or identify where one truly starts and the other ends. Ubuntu is an African term meaning humanity. It's sometimes translated as a person is a person through other people, or I am because you are. It is a collection of values and practices that people of Africa or of African origin view as making people authentic human beings. And while the nuances of these values and practices vary across different ethnic groups, they all point to one thing. An authentic individual human being is part of a larger and more significant relational, communal, societal, environmental, and spiritual world. A world where we remember that things operate far more in reciprocity and symbiosis with one another than through competition. Where we understand that what makes us different is our gift to the whole as opposed to a reason to shun. Where we understand that more diversity, whether biodiversity or diversity within species, makes us all stronger and more resilient. Homogeneity is not only boring, it's dangerous. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the indigenous method of the three sisters of companion planting. The three sisters, of course, are corn, beans, and squash. And when they're planted together, the corn is in the center and provides support for the beans to grow. The beans, in turn, provide nitrogen, enhancing the soil in the squash. And the squash leaves cool the soil and hinders weeds. So together, they grow stronger than any of them could individually. Another example of what I mean. And helping this story of one to emerge is what we mean when we ask, how can we move to a post-carbon carrying society? By asking this question, we simply mean, how do we live in a world where we understand the physical constraints that apply to all of the natural world and choose to live within them, while at the same time acting from a place of love and wonder for ourselves and our fellow journeymen? That is to say, how do we live with the story of one as our foundational premise? I'm reminded of the quote from the American poet Janine Marie Hagen, who said that in our time of disturbance and radical change, we are crossing a threshold, a portal, or an unseen bridge from one world to another. It could be said that the bridge is either collapsing beneath us or being made as we walk together in the long twilight hours when one civilization gives way to another. And in order to achieve this, there are a lot of systems that will need to change dramatically to support it. These include our food systems, our economic systems, our energy systems, our political systems, our transportation systems, our educational systems, and just about all our social systems. These will need to change in such a way as to reflect this new, old story of who we are, and one that has us recognizing the constraints imposed on all of nature and acting within them. We must develop a systemic lens that allows us to see the interconnections and relationships that we so commonly miss in our perspectives today. It means adopting the same kind of reciprocity and circularity in our systems that nature uses in hers. And at Common Earth, we developed this skill through a branch of science called biomimicry. It means caring about one another and about the other living species with the understanding that we each play an important role in that complex system that makes up the planet and her balance. So how do we do that? Well, the good news is that these are all just systems that we've made up. And if we can make these ones up, so too can we invent new ones. Humans have an amazing capacity of invention and resilience. If we have a clear goal and a clear view of our current reality, then we will naturally get there. We will find a way. But if and only if we give up our noisy minds. The problem is that we think that our thoughts, all that chatter in our minds, is us, and that our thoughts are reality. They are not. But we nonetheless allow ourselves to be shaped by all the limiting self-doubt and smallness that they so consistently feed us. We are so much bigger than the insecure thinking that causes us to consume more stuff, compare ourselves to others, either favorably or unfavorably, which really amounts to the same thing, engage in petty disputes, and act from places of scarcity and hoarding. We are each one of us capable of so much more empathy, kindness, generosity, and ingenuity than we think we are. And this insight about the foundational role that thinking plays is central to the work that we do at Common Earth, because it so fundamentally shapes the way that we experience the world. Not one of us ever experiences the world objectively, even though we all think we do. But rather we experience our thinking about the world. And when we can shift our thinking and our perspective, everything else shifts with it. I love this image because it illustrates how the world is comprised of systems and organizations that are built by communities, which are just a bunch of individuals, each of whom is doing what makes sense to them based on the stories or mental models or paradigms that they have in their minds. We spend a lot of time developing a systems thinking lens at Common Earth. And one of the many great insights that it brings us is that changing the paradigm that created the system in the first place is always where to find the most leverage in creating systemic change. But this can create some challenges and paradoxes, including the cognitive dissonance that is created by participating in the current inherently flawed and broken systems that surround us. But as journalist Bill McKibben has put it, changing the system, not perfecting our own lives, is the point. Hypocrisy is the price of admission in this battle. But we can't allow the imperfect choices we make now to prevent us from creating a new world with new systems, one where better choices are available to us. As the saying goes, we can't let perfection be the enemy of good enough, which is really just another way of saying that we can't let our thinking get in the way. And when we inevitably do, we must remember what Canadian poet and musician Leonard Cohen had to say about cracks in things. And that, of course, is that they are how the light gets in. The chorus to his magnificent song Anthem is, "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." So, This brings us to another great paradox. We're encouraging people to change their thinking, yet we know that individual changes in our thoughts and actions won't make the difference we need because this climate crisis requires collective and systemic change. But what is a collective consciousness other than a bunch of individual ones? And what are the systems that shape our individual choices, but a reflection of our collective thoughts? In 1992, David Bohm wrote a book called Thought as a System. And in it, he posits that thoughting is not thinking. When we just keep recirculating the same thoughts, he says we're thoughting. We only think we're thinking. However, he says, it's okay to do both because when we bring forward prior knowledge, or thoughting, it does not suppress new ideas. In fact, thoughting can lead to new and creative thinking. Thinking goes into the brain and leaves a trace, which becomes thought. And thought then automatically enters into our system of thinking. Which brings me first full circle back to stories. Because the single most powerful way I know of changing all this thinking and thoughting is through our stories. We think them up and they shape how we think about ourselves in either a beautiful or a dangerous reinforcing feedback loop. We do this in two ways. The first is through our personal conversations and narratives. As activist and speaker Katharine Hayhoe has said, the number one thing we can do is the exact thing we're not doing. Talk about it. So let's talk to each other because, as Bob Marley so famously sang, none but ourselves can free our minds. And this brings me to the second way our stories help us. And that is by creating new, bigger stories. Our fiction, our poetry, our movies, our music, our art. For as author and social activist Bell Hooks says, the function of art is to do more than to tell it like it is. It's to imagine what's possible. You may have noticed that this talk is rife with quotes by other people. That is intentional, and it is an homage to all of the great voices that have come before us, reminding us that we're not alone. Quantum entanglement is beginning to help us understand just how interconnected it all is. In fact, the great Austrian poet and novelist Rilke once wrote, "I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world." So widen your circles by finding your voice and lending it to theirs, by changing the stories you tell, both to yourself and to others. Joyfully create new stories and share them with passion. Listen intently with empathy and compassion to what all living things are telling us about what is unfolding and what to do about it. Insert yourself in positions of power where you can speak loudly from the new paradigm. We will need to sustain, inspire, and love one another on this journey. So always remember what climate activist and author Joanna Macy told us when she said, action isn't a burden to be hoisted up and lugged around on our shoulders. It is something we are. The work we have to do can be seen as a kind of coming alive. More than some moral imperative, it's an awakening to our true nature, a releasing of our gifts. For as environmental leader Robert Swan reminds us, the greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. And author Alice Walker cautions us that the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. So, in short, go forward, finding your own path and walk it fearlessly. Create new stories and be the change you want to see in helping the new post-carbon caring society to emerge. And if you are ever in doubt about your ability for you and your story to make a difference, just remember the concept of Wu Wei. In his book, Tao, the Watercourse Way, Alan Watts translates the Chinese concept of Wu Wei as not forcing. And he uses the image of water that, when trapped, rises to find a new outlet. Or as Margaret Atwood so beautifully wrote, water does not resist, water flows. When you plunge your hand into it, all you feel is a caress. Water is not a solid wall. It will not stop you. But water always goes where it wants to go, and nothing in the end can stand against it. Water is patient. Dripping water wears away a stone. Remember that, my child. Remember, you are half water. If you can't go through an obstacle, go around it. Water does. As Gary Nabin has written and Robin Wall Kimmerer has often quoted, we can't meaningfully proceed with healing, with restoration, without restoration. Descartes is perhaps one of the more influential thinkers that helped to usher in the era that began this story of more, when he famously said, I think, therefore I am. But when we come to understand how much our stories shape who we are, both individually and collectively, and that who we are shapes what we do, how we behave, the systems we create, the injustices we tolerate, then it becomes clear that it maybe should have been, I think, therefore we are. And I think it's time for us to recognize that we're all in this together and that we can create a better world by having better ideas, and for us to collectively embrace this story of one. I hope you join me. The world needs you. Thank you.